Hello, friends, and welcome to the Snoozy Scientist, where we gently explore the mysteries of our world, one sleepy yawn at a time. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend a little part of your evening, your morning, or perhaps somewhere in between, winding down with me. Tonight, we're traveling back to a time when Earth was not the place we know today. Imagine a world where the sky never cleared, where no sunrise ever broke through the clouds. Day after day, rain fell without pause, not for a season, not even for centuries, but for millions of years. It was a storm so unrelenting that entire continents drowned, forests rotted into swamps, rivers swelled into inland seas, feeding oceans that rose higher and higher to claim the land. The dimmed sun, hidden behind permanent storm, starved photosynthesis, leaving plants weak and fragile. Animals faced drowning and starvation in a world too wet to sustain them. This wasn't a myth or a legend, but a real chapter of Earth's ancient story. Scientists call it the Carnian Pluvial Event, an age in the late Triassic when rain and flood rewrote the rules of life, driving extinctions on land and sea, and opening the door for new creatures to rise. This was not a storm you could wait out. This was a planet remade by rain, and yet somehow life endured. But how did anything survive such a nightmare? How could ecosystems hold on when sunlight itself was choked away? How did food webs resist collapse, even when Earth seemed determined to wash them away? And why did life cling on instead of vanishing completely into the storm? Tonight, we'll drift softly into this forgotten age of eternal storms to uncover what strategies life invented to endure and how we know they worked. But before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from and what the time is there. It is always fascinating to think of these stories being heard across so many different skies. If you enjoy these gentle journeys into Earth's distant past, please do consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. A warm thank you as well to those of you who are already subscribed. You're helping this little corner of the internet grow. I hope this story soothes your mind and carries you gently toward rest. Now take a deep breath. Let your shoulders soften, and together, let's step into the forgotten age when the storm never stopped. Long before the first drop of endless rain began to fall, the stage was already being set deep inside the Earth. The late Triassic was an unstable time, a planet still reeling from past upheavals and preparing for new ones. Massive tectonic shifts were underway as the supercontinent Pangaea began to stretch and fracture. Beneath its crust, magma was on the move, pressurizing and surging upward, searching for weakness. At the surface, this restlessness expressed itself through chains of volcanoes, fissures, and eruptions that would change the atmosphere forever. Volcanoes are among Earth's most powerful agents of transformation. Each eruption releases more than ash and fire. Invisible gases billow into the skies, gases that alter climate for millennia. During this time, vast amounts of carbon dioxide and methane were released, thickening the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. These gases trapped heat close to the planet's surface, driving global temperatures upward. The air grew heavier, wetter, and increasingly unstable. As temperatures rose, the cycle of water itself shifted. Warm oceans evaporated faster, sending colossal amounts of moisture skyward. Once aloft, that water condensed into storm systems that swelled larger and more violent than anything in our modern experience. These were not storms that lasted for weeks or months. They were storms that once ignited did not truly end. With the atmosphere saturated and the skies endlessly replenished, the Earth entered a feedback loop of warmth and water that sustained rain for nearly 2 million years. The evidence of this transformation is written into stone. Sediment layers from the late Triassic are marked by abrupt changes that stand out like bold strokes in Earth's diary. Before the event, many deposits were consistent with arid environments, reflecting a world where deserts were vast and rainfall scarce. Then suddenly, in outcrops scattered across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, the rock record tells a different story. Layers once dominated by wind-blown sand give way to water-laid mudstones and silts, filled with ripple marks from flowing currents and impressions left by standing water. Ancient floodplains expanded and shifted, leaving behind stacked sequences of silt and clay that could only have been laid down by persistent rainfall and overflowing rivers. In some regions, sediments show evidence of entire basins being drowned. Rivers that once carved narrow valleys spilled across wide plains. Inland seas expanded and deepened as runoff poured in from every direction. Sedimentary layers preserve the story of these floods, with alternating bands of coarse and fine material, evidence of repeated surges of water rushing through, retreating slightly, and then returning again and again. The repetition speaks of storms so constant that there was no time for landscapes to recover before the next deluge arrived. Fossilized soils also hold quiet testimony to this shift. Before the Carnian Pluvial Event, ancient soils were often dry, packed with minerals typical of arid climates. During the event, however, soils became waterlogged and oxygen poor. They turned darker, richer in clays and iron oxides, their chemistry altered by standing water. In some exposures, paleosols reveal horizons streaked with clay, a bluish-gray tint formed when iron in the soil is stripped of oxygen by saturation. These colors are fingerprints of rain that did not relent. Geologists studying these layers find the same story repeated across continents. It was not a local storm system or a regional climate pattern, it was global. Sediment cores from deep lakes and ancient seas align with outcrops on land, all showing synchronous spikes in waterborne deposits. Even in regions that had been desert, sand was replaced by silt, and wind-shaped dunes gave way to mud-cracked floodplains. The earth itself was transformed into a mosaic of drenched landscapes. This flooding did more than reshape coastlines and drown valleys. It accelerated the erosion of mountains and highlands. Rock faces, constantly battered by rain, broke down into grains and were swept away, carried into lowlands and seas. In only a few million years, mountains that might have taken tens of millions of years to erode under normal conditions were worn down at astonishing speed. Sediment filled basins so quickly that in some places entire ecosystems were buried, their remains preserved in thick, muddy blankets. These changes were catastrophic for life. Creatures and plants that had adapted to drier conditions were suddenly trapped in a soaked and unstable world. But for geologists looking back, the evidence is clear. The Carnian Pluvial Event was no myth, no exaggeration. It was a time when volcanoes, gases, and shifting continents conspired to open the skies, unleashing a storm that would not stop. And as the rain began its endless fall, Earth's landscapes were rewritten in water and mud, preparing the stage for life to face its most relentless test. As the skies opened and the storms refused to fade, the face of the Earth was slowly, steadily transformed. What had once been a supercontinent, marked by deserts and dry plains, became a realm defined by water. Rain ran off mountainsides in torrents, carving deep grooves and carrying fine grains of soil toward the lowlands. Valleys filled, rivers swelled, and the outlines of the land blurred as water claimed ground that had long been dry. Swamps spread across vast regions, taking hold where forests once stood. Roots of ancient trees drowned in soggy soils, leaving behind tangled wetlands where only the hardiest plants could survive. The air above these places grew heavy with mist, while the ground below became a patchwork of shallow pools and shifting mud. These swamps were not isolated pockets. They stretched for hundreds of miles, forming interconnected wetlands that covered entire landscapes. Floodplains, too, expanded beyond recognition. Rivers that once followed narrow paths across valleys began to spill outward, flooding the land around them again and again. Each time the storms returned, the rivers rose higher, and when they receded, they left behind layers of silt and clay. Seasonality blurred, for there were no longer predictable wet and dry periods. The floods came often, sometimes never receding before the next surge arrived. In this way, wide floodplains built up, their soils endlessly reworked, never fully drying, always saturated. Some rivers grew so immense that they ceased to resemble rivers at all. Their swollen channels merged with one another, spreading across the land until they resembled shallow inland seas. Water that once moved swiftly down narrow valleys became sluggish, pooling across entire basins. What had been grasslands or dry flats became shallow lakes that stretched far beyond the horizon, filled not by tides, but by unrelenting rain. In places where tectonic shifts had already created natural depressions, the rains filled them to the brim, forming deep inland seas. These bodies of water had shorelines that shifted constantly as rainfall continued and sediments washed in, burying whatever ecosystems had once tried to take hold. Evidence of this transformation is preserved in the rocks that formed during this time. Sedimentary layers from the Late Triassic are stacked thick with mudstones and silts that show repeated flooding. Within these layers are ripple marks, preserved impressions of flowing water that moved across once stable surfaces. Some rocks record mud cracks, revealing that water sometimes lingered long enough to soak the soil before drying just briefly, only to be drowned again. The repetition of these features across hundreds of meters of rock tells us that the floods were not brief interruptions, but recurring cycles, unbroken for millions of years. Soils from this era also tell the story of water's dominance. Geologists studying paleosols, or ancient soils preserved within rock sequences, find signs of repeated saturation. Instead of dry, crumbly structures, these soils are mottled and streaked with colors formed when oxygen was stripped away by standing water. Blues, grays, and deep reds mark the ancient ground, recording a world where oxygen in the soil was constantly displaced, suffocating plant roots and reshaping the chemistry of the land. The layering of these paleosols shows that this was not a single event, but a continuous process. Each horizon builds upon the last, one waterlogged layer stacked upon another, evidence of centuries upon centuries of rain-soaked earth. Even more striking are the fossils entombed within these sediments. In floodplain deposits, scientists find plant material preserved in unusual abundance. Whole trunks of trees are caught in the mud, their growth rings halted suddenly, as if the forests themselves were overwhelmed by the water. Leaves, pollen, and spores appear in thick concentrations, showing not steady flourishing, but sudden drownings followed by pulses of regrowth. The fossil record does not tell the story of stable forests, but of ecosystems constantly reset by the return of floods. Animals, too, left their traces in this saturated world. Trackways of reptiles and amphibians appear in sediments that were laid down by shallow water, their prints pressed into mud that hardened before the next inundation. Some layers preserve bones of creatures caught in floods, swept away by rivers that no longer followed predictable paths. In some regions, fish fossils are found far inland, their remains deposited by rivers that had expanded into vast freshwater seas. The scale of this watery transformation is difficult to picture. Entire regions that had once been dry, dotted with conifer forests or scrubby vegetation, were reshaped into drowned landscapes. Water became the dominant sculptor, building and erasing habitats at a pace too fast for many organisms to adapt. Where there had been deserts, there were now wetlands. Where there had been fertile valleys, there were now floodplains, too unstable to hold long-lived plants. Where there had been rivers, there were now seas. The earth had become, quite literally, a world of endless water, and everything that lived upon it was forced to navigate an environment that never stayed the same for long. As the world on land drowned under rain, many of its living things turned toward the water itself for refuge. The shallow seas, spreading across the edges of the supercontinent, became strange sanctuaries. These were not the calm blue waters we might picture today, but murky basins filled with silt and stirred by storms, and yet they offered something precious. They offered a chance to endure. Shallow seas are unique places. Unlike the deep ocean where light barely reaches, the shallows lie close to the surface, touched by what little sunlight can break through heavy clouds. Even under skies dimmed by endless rain, enough light filtered down to sustain photosynthetic life. Small algae floated in the upper layers, capturing what energy they could. These algae became the foundation for food webs, feeding tiny drifting animals and fish larvae, which in turn supported larger creatures. Coral-like ecosystems, though stressed, clung to existence in these settings. True corals, as we know them, were not yet dominant, but other reef-building organisms created frameworks of shelter in the shallows. Sponges, microbial mats, and bivalves helped knit together structures that resisted the pull of currents. These living reefs were not the vast, bright kingdoms of later oceans, but patchy refuges where species could hide and feed. In their crevices, small creatures sheltered from predators and from the constant stirring of the water above. Fossils tell us that shallow marine creatures found ways to adapt in these conditions. Bivalves, with their hinged shells, flourished in muddy seabeds, filtering food from turbid waters. Ammonoids, relatives of modern squids, swam in large numbers, their coiled shells recording their growth even through unstable times. Fish of many shapes and sizes left behind teeth and bones in the sediments, showing that while some lineages perished, others radiated into the new habitats created by swelling seas. The sediments themselves preserve quiet details of this survival. Layers of limestone and mudstone from shallow seas contain ripple marks frozen in time, recording currents that moved across the seabed. Within them lie shells, sometimes still articulated, suggesting creatures buried alive by sudden influxes of silt. Other layers contain dense beds of small fossils, evidence of life rebounding after each disturbance. The pattern is one of repeated stress, but also repeated recovery. In some areas, scientists have discovered entire assemblages of shallow sea organisms fossilized together. These fossil beds act like snapshots, capturing ecosystems in place. They show a mixture of species, from filter feeders anchored in the seabed to free-swimming predators that darted through the water. The diversity in these beds is striking, given the environmental pressures of the time. It suggests that the shallows acted as stabilizing zones, where energy from the dimmed sun could still move up the food chain, and where species had enough space and resources to persist. The shallows also acted as nurseries. Just as many marine species today lay eggs or raise young in coastal waters, Triassic seas provided sheltered places for juvenile creatures. The wide, shallow expanses created by flooded lowlands gave space for young fish and invertebrates to grow with less risk from the harsher conditions of the open sea. These nurseries helped replenish populations even as storms and floods wiped out others. The resilience of these communities is remarkable. Each surge of rain washed new sediments into the seas, smothering habitats and forcing creatures to adapt or move. Yet time and again, life returned. Filter feeders shifted to new feeding strategies. Reefs grew back in slightly different forms, and predators followed the cycles of prey. It was a constant process of collapse and renewal, repeated over centuries, that blurred into millennia. Shallow seas, then, were not simply places to hide. They were active engines of survival, recycling energy and maintaining a thread of continuity in a world where stability was rare. Without them, much of marine life might have vanished altogether. The evidence left in stone tells us that even in the most unstable climates, there are always pockets of resilience, places where the rhythm of life can continue. And while the land above remained soaked and transformed, beneath the restless waters of the shallows, life clung to fragile but enduring footholds. As the rains continued without pause, new landscapes began to emerge across the Triassic world. What had once been uplands and valleys were transformed into vast stretches of standing water, mud, and thick vegetation. These were the swamps, sprawling and untamed, stretching for miles in every direction. They were not gentle wetlands, but chaotic mosaics of shallow pools, floating mats of plants, and soils so waterlogged that every step sank into them. Yet in this unstable world, life found a way to make these soggy expanses into kingdoms of their own. Plants were the first to seize this opportunity. In the swamp kingdom, only species that could withstand constant flooding and oxygen-poor soils prospered. Some grew with wide, flaring bases that anchored them in unstable ground, while others evolved curious aerial roots that rose above the surface like twisted stilts, drawing in the air that the mud below denied them. Certain plants developed spongy tissues that carried oxygen down into submerged roots, functioning like natural snorkels. These small adjustments opened the door to survival, and then to dominance, in a world that never seemed to dry. Horsetails, already ancient by the time of the Carnian Pluvial Event, became one of the characteristic swamp dwellers. They grew in dense clusters along the edges of shallow waters, their tall stems forming living fences that swayed with the rise and fall of the floods. Ferns thrived as well, sending spores drifting through the moist air to colonize every open patch of soggy soil. Primitive conifers, smaller and hardier than their forest-dwelling relatives, adapted to the instability and flourished in many regions. These plants gave the swamps a peculiar look, part forest and part marsh, a green tangle perfectly suited to the damp. Swamps, paradoxically, were both sites of decay and engines of new productivity. Every surface was coated in wet plant debris, from mats of fallen leaves to floating logs that refused to rot away completely. Oxygen was too scarce for rapid breakdown, so organic matter accumulated in dark, rich layers. Within this dampness, nutrients cycled differently than in dry environments. Instead of being lost, they lingered, fueling plant growth in a constant loop. The swamps became cradles of biodiversity, where plants and animals tested new strategies and formed webs of life distinct from those in drier landscapes. Fossils give us glimpses into the richness of these ecosystems. In sedimentary rocks from the Late Triassic, layers appear dense with preserved organic matter, bands of blackened plant remains marking the places where swamps once stood. Within them, delicate impressions of ferns, horsetails, and flood-tolerant conifers have been found, each stamped into stone like pressed pages of an ancient book. Fossil pollen and spores add another layer of evidence. Under the microscope, scientists see a marked shift. Species adapted to wet environments suddenly dominate, spreading in all directions while their dryland relatives fade from view. And it was not only plants that made these swamps their home. Insects buzzed and crawled among the vegetation, their remains preserved alongside leaves and stems. Amphibians lurked in shallow pools, while reptiles patrolled the tangled margins, taking advantage of the abundance of prey. Floating mats of vegetation served as both food and shelter, creating microhabitats where small animals could hide or hunt. The swamps, far from being stagnant wastelands, teemed with activity. Over time, these environments left behind immense stores of organic deposits. The waterlogged soils, filled with partially decayed plant matter, built up layer upon layer. Compressed over millions of years, they became records of productivity and persistence. Each dark stratum in the rocks is a signature of life's ability to flourish in conditions that seemed hostile on the surface. The Swamp Kingdom was not a shadow of what came before, but something entirely new. It was a world of invention, where life adjusted to water's dominance and created ecosystems of surprising resilience. Giant horsetails lined the water's edge, ferns spread like green lace across the damp ground, and flood-tolerant conifers added structure to the tangle. The constant rains may have stripped oxygen from the soil and filled the air with the scent of decay, but they also nurtured a kingdom of abundance. In these swamps, life found a balance in instability. Every adaptation, from snorkel-like roots to spore-borne expansion, told the same story. Even in the wettest, most oxygen-starved corners of Earth, plants and animals could build new worlds. The Swamp Kingdom was not defined by collapse, but by flourishing, a reminder that even under the heaviest rains, creation never ceased. In a world smothered by endless storms, when the forests collapsed into sodden heaps and the land was carved into swamps, a quiet kingdom rose into dominance. The fungi, usually hidden in the soil or sprouting briefly from fallen wood, found themselves in a paradise of dampness and decay, where larger creatures weakened and plants drowned in oxygen-starved mud. Fungi stretched their unseen networks into every corner of the drowned earth. For them, the rain was not a punishment. It was an invitation. Everywhere the floods gathered, life left behind debris, trunks stripped of their leaves, branches snapped and waterlogged, mats of fallen vegetation pressed into the swamp floor. In drier ages, this material would have crumbled quickly into soil, but in the world of constant rain, it piled up in heavy layers. Oxygen could not seep far into the dense, wet ground, and without it, most decomposers struggled to function. Yet fungi thrived precisely here, in the shadows of decay. Thread-like hyphae, the building blocks of fungal life, reached out through mud and wood like living threads of silk. They formed sprawling networks, invisible but vast, tunneling into drowned tree trunks, creeping through sodden leaves, and winding through the dark soils of swamps. With powerful enzymes, fungi dismantled what rain had brought down. They dissolved lignin and cellulose, the very molecules that had given plants their strength, and in doing so, they freed energy and nutrients locked within. It was this ability to break down what others could not that gave fungi their power in a world of unending storms. On the surface, their fruiting bodies, mushrooms, molds, and clusters of sporangia sprouted in abundance. They painted decaying logs with pale fans, spread like a lace of white threads over leaves, and sometimes rose in thick fleshy caps that became food for insects and small animals. But the true strength of fungi lay underground, where their webs connected root to root, tree to tree, forming vast networks. These hidden threads moved nutrients like lifelines through the forest floor, sharing what they gathered with plants that managed to cling on in the swamps. Even in a rain-heavy world, these silent bridges of survival tied ecosystems together. Evidence of their dominance can still be read in stone. Triassic rocks laid down during the Carnian Pluvial Event often hold layers dense with fungal spores and filaments. Under a microscope, scientists see the shapes of hyphae etched in ancient sediments, frozen remnants of fungal growth. Chemical traces tell a similar story. Fossil soils and floodplain deposits show spikes in compounds linked to fungal enzymes, as if the very chemistry of the earth had been altered by their activity. These signals point to something extraordinary. Fungi were not just present, they were flourishing, expanding their reach in ways unseen before. Their influence spread far beyond the forest floor. By breaking down vast stores of plant matter, fungi released nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon back into circulation. These nutrients leached into swamp waters, fed rooted plants adapted to the damp, and supported entire webs of life that depended on the recycling. Insects fed on fungal growths, amphibians feasted on the insects, and reptiles hunted the amphibians. In this way, fungi sat quietly at the foundation, propping up chains of survival that otherwise might have collapsed under the weight of the rain. The surge of fungi during the rains is part of a much deeper pattern in Earth's story. Time and again, whenever climates tipped into extremes, fungi seized the opportunity. After wildfires, they appeared first on charred wood. After floods, they colonized drowned forests. During the Carnian Pluvial Event, when the skies darkened for millions of years, their expansion became a global force. They did not resist the decay, they transformed it. They turned what seemed like ruin into the raw material of renewal. Imagine those ancient swamps, the air heavy with the smell of wet rot, the ground dark with pools of stagnant water. Yet beneath the gloom, fungal webs stitched together the living and the dead, spreading through roots and wood, endlessly breaking down and rebuilding. They were invisible architects, patient and tireless, ensuring that the thread of life did not snap. In the age of unbroken storms, fungi did more than survive. They kept the cycle of survival alive for everything else. Beneath the swollen swamps and in the dim shallows of inland seas, life persisted in its most humble and tenacious form. While towering forests collapsed into rot and animals struggled to breathe in the heavy, oxygen-starved air, microbes continued almost unbothered. Invisible to the naked eye, they slipped into every crevice of this drowned world, clinging to mud, rock, and even each other, shaping a living layer that no amount of rain could wash away. Microbes have always been Earth's quiet masters of endurance. They were among the first to colonize the planet, and they have never relinquished that claim. In the age of unending storms, they thrived not because conditions were gentle, but because they were harsh. The skies dimmed, leaving little sunlight for photosynthesis. Oxygen levels rose and fell unpredictably as floodwaters surged and retreated. Soils shifted between suffocation and brief breathability. For larger plants and animals, these swings spelled catastrophe. For microbes, they were simply another puzzle to solve. Across shallow pools and floodplains, they built vast microbial mats, structures that looked like nothing more than thin layers of slime, but were in fact bustling metropolises of microscopic life. These mats layered themselves like blankets, with each stratum adapted to its own microenvironment. At the surface, light-loving cyanobacteria captured the faint rays that pierced the storm-dark skies. Just beneath them, other microbes used the byproducts of photosynthesis to power their own metabolism, some flourishing in near-total darkness and without oxygen. Together, these communities formed a chain of survival, each layer feeding the next. The mats anchored the muddy bottoms of swamps and inland seas, holding sediments in place that otherwise would have washed away in torrents. They produced oxygen when conditions allowed, and when it did not, they shifted to other strategies, generating energy from sulfur, iron, or methane. These living carpets made the unstable world beneath the rains more habitable, creating consistency where chaos reigned. On fallen logs and submerged leaves, microbes assembled themselves into biofilms, communities bound together in sticky secretions that glued them to surfaces. These glossy layers grew thick across every waterlogged surface, resisting the push of floods and the constant shifting of soils. A biofilm was more than just a cluster of cells, it was a fortress. Within its slimy shield, microbes shared resources, passed signals to one another, and created microenvironments that allowed them to survive extremes of pH, oxygen loss, and sudden chemical changes. Even within the guts of small invertebrates feeding in the swamps, biofilms thrived, turning every possible niche into a home. The persistence of these invisible worlds is recorded in the rocks. Sediments laid down during the Carnian Pluvial Event carry chemical fingerprints of microbial life, long after the organisms themselves vanished. Spikes of sulfur compounds and unusual concentrations of iron reveal the handiwork of bacteria that specialized in energy pathways far removed from oxygen. These geochemical traces tell us that microbes were not just present, but abundant, sculpting the chemistry of entire landscapes. Their work reshaped waters and soils long before larger creatures could recover. To glimpse their resilience, we need only look at the living analogs of today. In hot springs, microbes thrive in scalding waters colored with bands of orange, green, and gold, each hue marking a community tuned to a precise temperature and chemistry. In acidic bogs, microbes endure where few plants can grow, feeding on iron and producing strange metallic waters. In flooded rice fields, modern descendants switch between oxygen-based and oxygen-free metabolisms in response to daily cycles of wetness and dryness. These places are reminders that the strategies microbes used during the Triassic storms remain alive, unchanged for millions of years. In the drowned landscapes of deep time, microbes likely worked in much the same way. They kept oxygen flowing in pockets where it could, consumed toxins where it could not, and sustained the base of food webs that otherwise might have collapsed entirely. Larger organisms, plants, amphibians, insects, were fragile, tied to the whims of light and oxygen. Microbes were not. They filled every droplet, every pore of soil, every thin film of water, creating a safety net that ensured life at its smallest scale would endure. The rain that seemed so destructive to forests and animals became simply another backdrop for microbial survival. Their worlds were measured not in forests or rivers, but in micrometers and molecules. Where other life forms saw barriers, microbes saw opportunity. And in that endless age of storms, when the skies poured without rest, they proved again why they are Earth's oldest and most dependable survivors. In a world that seemed set on drowning itself, when forests gave way to swamps and floods rewrote the land, survival often came down to something tiny. It was not always the towering trees or the great reptiles that carried life forward, but the smallest of packages, seeds and spores, no bigger than grains of dust. These were nature's life rafts, evolutionary capsules designed to endure when the environment turned hostile. Spores, produced by ferns, mosses, and fungi, are some of the simplest survival structures on Earth. Each spore is a single cell wrapped in a tough wall, light enough to drift on wind or water, resilient enough to withstand extremes of moisture or darkness. When floods stripped away soils and plants collapsed into decay, spores floated above the chaos, carried to new places where they could wait, patient and silent, until conditions allowed them to grow. In this way, even when entire ecosystems vanished underwater, the possibility of life lingered in the air and soil, hidden in microscopic resilience. Seeds offered another kind of survival. Unlike spores, seeds carried not just the embryo of a new plant, but also a reserve of food and protective layers. Some seeds could lie dormant for years, encased in shells that resisted water and rot. Others were designed to travel. The swollen rivers and inland seas of the Triassic became highways for seeds, carrying them to distant shores. Seeds that landed on patches of ground high enough to escape permanent flooding could sprout, beginning new generations even as the rains continued to fall. Fungi, too, relied on spores. Their fruiting bodies produced millions, even billions of them, released into the damp air. Spores settled into cracks of decaying wood, into the folds of leaves, and into the muddy banks of rivers. From these hidden shelters, new fungal networks could spread when old ones were destroyed. In the endless cycle of rot and renewal that defined this drowned world, fungal spores became essential to keeping nutrient cycles alive. The fossil record preserves clear traces of these strategies in Triassic sediments laid down during the Carnian Pluvial Event. Layers rich in fossilized pollen and spores stand out. Under the microscope, scientists see bursts of diversity, sudden increases in the abundance of certain types of spores and pollen. These shifts mark periods when the rain disrupted existing plant communities, sweeping away forests and favoring species that reproduced quickly and spread widely. The dominance of ferns and other spore-bearing plants in some layers is a direct reflection of this resilience. They were able to recolonize devastated landscapes faster than seed plants, their spores drifting on every gust of wind, ready to sprout in bare soil once the floods receded. Pollen grains add further detail to this story. Each type of plant produces pollen with unique shapes and surface textures, and in the fossil record, these differences are preserved. By studying them, paleobotanists can reconstruct which plants survived and which disappeared. During the rain-soaked millions of years of the Carnian Pluvial Event, pollen records reveal rapid turnovers. Entire plant lineages declined, but others surged in their place, leaving behind dense accumulations of pollen that speak of persistence. Even when forests collapsed, pollen records show that plants were still producing, still scattering their survival capsules into the world. There is something quietly remarkable about this story. Seeds and spores, so small they can be overlooked, carried the potential of whole ecosystems inside them. They held the memory of forests, the possibility of swamps, the promise of renewal. Without them, much of life might have been erased by the constant rains. Instead, these tiny vessels allowed species to outlast the storm, to bridge the gap between collapse and regrowth. In the drowned Triassic world, survival often meant shrinking to the smallest form possible, hiding in the soil, the water, or the air. Seeds and spores became the silent guardians of life's continuity, waiting for their chance to awaken when the clouds at last began to lift. While many animals faltered under the weight of endless storms, one group seemed curiously at home in the soaked and swollen world. Amphibians, with their dual connection to water and land, were creatures shaped by dampness. They did not merely survive the great rains of the Triassic, they thrived in the niches created by swamps, floodplains, and shallow lakes. In a time when dry ground was scarce and forests collapsed under waterlogged soils, amphibians found opportunity where others found only struggle. Amphibians are ancient survivors. Their lineage reaches back hundreds of millions of years, long before the first dinosaurs walked the earth. Their very biology is tuned to moisture. With skin that breathes and eggs that must be laid in water, they are bound to damp environments in a way no reptiles or mammals could tolerate. When the rains of the Carnian Pluvial Event transformed the land into a patchwork of swamps and shallow seas, amphibians slipped easily into the new reality. Fossil evidence shows us just how diverse and widespread they were during this time. Large amphibians, some stretching longer than a person is tall, prowled through Triassic waterways. These were not the delicate frogs we might imagine today, but sturdy creatures with heavy skulls and broad jaws, well suited to catching fish and small reptiles in turbid waters. Their bodies were built for semi-aquatic life, with strong limbs to push through mud and long tails to propel them through flooded channels. Alongside these giants, smaller amphibians occupied the shallows and wetlands. Fossil trackways preserved in sediments from the late Triassic reveal the impressions of their feet, pressed into soft mud that was later buried and turned to stone. These tracks, meandering across floodplains and stream banks, are direct evidence of amphibians moving through a waterlogged world, using the very landscapes that had forced so many other creatures into decline. The persistence of amphibians in this era reflects more than just luck. They carried adaptations perfectly suited for unstable climates. Their porous skin allowed them to absorb oxygen even in low oxygen waters, giving them an advantage in stagnant swamps where fish sometimes struggled. Their life cycles, tied to both water and land, allowed them to exploit environments others avoided. Eggs could be laid in temporary pools, tadpoles could grow quickly in shallow waters, and adults could hunt on land when conditions allowed. This flexibility gave them a foothold in nearly every wet environment the rains created. Amphibians also benefited from the collapse of larger animals. When food chains fractured, and herbivores and predators alike struggled with shrinking resources, amphibians occupied smaller, more stable niches. They could feed on insects, worms, and aquatic prey that remained abundant in swamps and flooded soils. Their relatively small size and rapid reproduction meant populations could recover quickly after floods or environmental shocks. They became, in many ways, symbols of survival in unstable times. Fossils confirm that several amphibian lineages passed through the Carnian Pluvial Event with surprising success. Temnospondyls, a diverse group of large amphibians, left behind skulls, vertebrae, and limb bones in sediments across Europe, Asia, and North America. These fossils show that even as reptiles and early dinosaurs were only beginning to rise, amphibians maintained a strong presence in the waterways. Some species would persist for tens of millions of years beyond this event, a testament to their adaptability. Their survival also had lasting ecological importance. Amphibians linked aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, moving nutrients between water and land. As both predators and prey, they helped stabilize food webs in environments where stability was rare. The very traits that tied them to water made them emblematic of ages when moisture reigned. In the story of endless rain, amphibians stand out not only as survivors, but as creatures that seemed almost designed for such conditions. When we look at the fossil record of this time, it is not only the drowned forests or the swollen rivers that capture attention, but also the quiet persistence of amphibians. They remind us that sometimes survival favors the adaptable, the small, the creatures whose bodies are tuned to live in the margins where others cannot endure. In every age of Earth's history, giants have risen. Vast forests have stretched skyward, their trunks towering above the ground, and animals of extraordinary size have stalked beneath them. Yet giants are often fragile. Their immense bodies depend on steady supplies of food, stable environments, and reliable energy. When the rains of the Carnian Pluvial Event fell for nearly 2 million years without reprieve, these requirements became impossible to meet. The great experiment of size began to collapse under the weight of water. For plants, the challenge was immediate. Trees that had once dominated dry uplands and wide plains could not tolerate soils that stayed waterlogged year after year. Their roots, starved of oxygen, weakened. Their trunks softened as fungal decay spread through damp wood. Even those that stood firm found themselves competing for light in skies dimmed by endless clouds. Growth slowed, reproduction faltered, and vast stands of trees disappeared. The fossil record shows sudden declines in pollen from conifer species that had once been widespread. In their place rose smaller, more flood-tolerant plants, but the days of towering forests in many regions were over. Animals faced challenges just as dire. Large herbivores relied on dense vegetation to feed their immense bodies. When forests thinned and plants faltered, food became scarce. The swamps and floodplains that spread across the land provided some resources, but they were unstable environments, constantly reshaped by floods and erosion. For great animals that required large home ranges and steady supplies of food, the patchwork of swamps was not enough. Body sizes began to shrink, a pattern often seen in the fossil record during times of stress. Smaller animals require less food and can reproduce more quickly, while giants, once symbols of power, became vulnerable. Predators, too, were caught in the spiral of scarcity. Large carnivores depend on abundant prey. When plant-eating animals declined, the food chains above them faltered. Fossil deposits from the Late Triassic reveal gaps where once diverse assemblages of large animals should have been. In some regions, bones of giant amphibians and reptiles vanish from the record during the wettest phases, replaced by traces of smaller, more adaptable species. It is as though the world itself was quietly shifting its favor away from size and toward resilience. The struggle of giants can be seen in the details of their fossils. Bones of large amphibians show signs of stress, with growth rings that narrow during years of hardship, much like tree rings in a drought. In some places, skeletons are found in layers of flood deposits, evidence of animals caught and drowned as rivers surged beyond their banks. Other fossils show abrupt disappearances, species that once thrived vanishing from the record within the span of a few geological layers. These patterns speak not of gradual decline alone, but of sudden collapses, where storms and scarcity combine to overwhelm even the strongest. Among plants, the evidence is just as striking. Fossil wood from the Triassic often shows signs of fungal invasion and decay, suggesting that trees weakened quickly in the wettest conditions. Pollen records reveal turnovers, with the dominance of some tree lineages abruptly broken. Instead of the steady continuity expected in stable ecosystems, there are gaps, sudden silences in the record of once abundant species. In their place, the smaller survivors, ferns and flood-tolerant shrubs, left their spores and pollen in abundance, filling the void left by giants that could no longer endure. The disappearance of these towering species reshaped landscapes as much as the rain itself. Without great forests, soils eroded more quickly, feeding even more sediment into rivers and seas. Without large herbivores, the balance of ecosystems shifted, giving opportunities to smaller, more opportunistic creatures. It was a cascade of change, triggered not only by storms in the sky, but by the collapse of those that once stood tallest on land and swam largest in the waters. The story written in stone is one of giants brought low by conditions they could not master. They remind us that size is not always strength, and that in times of relentless upheaval, survival often belongs not to the mighty, but to the adaptable, the small, and the patient. Above the soaked world of the Triassic, clouds pressed together in an almost unbroken ceiling. They carried torrents of rain, but they also cast a deeper consequence upon the planet below. With the sun veiled day after day, the light that filtered through was dim and scattered. Plants which relied on the steady rhythm of sunlight to power photosynthesis struggled in the gloom. The green engines of Earth slowed. Photosynthesis is the process that not only fuels plant growth, but also releases oxygen into the air. Each leaf is like a tiny solar panel, capturing light and turning it into chemical energy. Yet when the skies remained heavy and gray, those panels flickered. The production of oxygen dipped, almost imperceptibly at first, but steadily enough that it began to ripple across every form of life that breathed. Animals depend on oxygen for every heartbeat, every movement, every moment of awareness. When oxygen levels fall, the effects are subtle but severe. Muscles fatigue more quickly, growth slows. Large animals, with their greater demands, suffer the most. In the Triassic, as rains dimmed the skies, the air itself became thinner of breath, making survival more difficult not only on land but also in the waters that filled the world. The oceans, swollen with freshwater runoff, bore their own burden. When too much organic material washed into seas and lakes, microbes consumed it greedily, using oxygen in the process. In stagnant waters, this consumption outpaced replenishment. Oxygen levels plummeted, creating dead zones where fish and invertebrates could no longer live. These low oxygen zones likely expanded during the Carnian Pluvial Event, turning vast stretches of shallow seas into suffocating environments. For creatures that had once thrived there, escape was the only option, if escape was even possible. The signs of this silent suffocation are etched into the chemistry of rocks. Ancient sediments carry isotopic fingerprints that reveal changes in oxygen levels long vanished from the air. Ratios of carbon isotopes show that photosynthesis slowed dramatically during this wet phase, as plants failed to capture light and carbon dioxide accumulated. Sulfur isotopes and iron deposits preserve traces of oxygen-poor waters, where chemical reactions unfolded differently in the absence of oxygen. Together, these signals confirm that the Triassic atmosphere and seas were not simply wet, but starved of breath. In some rock layers, geologists find bands rich in black shales, dark sediments packed with organic matter that failed to decay fully in oxygen-deprived waters. These shales are the geological remains of ancient anoxia, conditions where oxygen fell so low that decomposition slowed and organic debris piled up layer by layer. Each dark band is a silent testament to a time when life above and below the water gasped against the tightening grip of oxygen loss. For animals, this strangulation was not sudden, like a predator's bite. It was gradual, a slow erosion of vitality. Growth rings in bones from the period suggest that many vertebrates grew more slowly, their development stunted by limited oxygen. Populations shrank, and diversity narrowed as species that demanded more oxygen vanished, leaving behind only those small enough or efficient enough to endure in thinner air. The fragility of this balance is striking. A veil of clouds across the sky, a dimming of photosynthesis, and suddenly every breath was more difficult. Even today, we see echoes of this in modern ecosystems. In warm lakes and coastal seas, when oxygen dips, fish die in great numbers, floating to the surface in haunting stillness. These modern events, brief though they are, mirror the struggles that unfolded for millions of years in the Triassic world. The rain fell, the skies darkened, and while the storms sculpted landscapes on the surface, a quieter transformation unfolded in the very chemistry of the atmosphere and seas. Oxygen, the breath of life, slipped away bit by bit, and with it, the fate of countless creatures hung in fragile balance. While many creatures gasped for air in the thin atmosphere of the Carnian Pluvial Event, and forests collapsed into swamps under endless rain, fish discovered a new world opening before them. The very floods that erased habitats for some became vast opportunities for others. Rivers swollen beyond their banks, floodplains stretching into shallow seas, and coastlines reshaped by freshwater runoff all created new waterways for fish to explore. In a world soaked through, their kingdom expanded. Freshwater fish found themselves in an interconnected landscape unlike any that had existed before. Streams and rivers, once confined to narrow valleys, spilled across continents, linking basins that had long been isolated. These connections allowed populations that had been separated for millions of years to meet. Genetic exchanges flowed as freely as the waters themselves, leading to bursts of diversity. Fossils of freshwater fish from this period reveal sudden expansions in both numbers and variety as species took advantage of the newly joined waterways. Some fish evolved bodies suited for sluggish, murky channels, with broad fins to navigate waters choked with silt. Others adapted to life in floodplain lakes, developing specialized feeding structures for filtering insects and debris washed in from the land. The abundance of shallow, nutrient-rich habitats allowed fish to experiment with forms and behaviors, creating evolutionary openings in every direction. Where swamps and shallow seas merged, fish crossed boundaries between freshwater and marine environments, pushing the limits of their adaptability. Marine fish also seized upon the opportunities of the age. The heavy rainfall and runoff changed the chemistry of the oceans, diluting salt levels in coastal waters. While this stress harmed some marine life, it favored fish able to tolerate fluctuating salinity. Species that could move between salt and fresh water flourished, exploiting environments that others abandoned. Fossils of Triassic fish show a proliferation of forms during this time, from sleek predators with sharp teeth to bottom dwellers with armored scales. It was an age of experimentation, recorded in bones and scales pressed into stone. The fossil evidence of this expansion is striking. In sedimentary layers laid down during the Carnian Pluvial Event, paleontologists uncovered dense accumulations of fish remains. Some deposits preserve entire schools, their skeletons locked together in fine muds, a frozen image of once teeming waters. Others contain teeth, spines, and scales shed in abundance, signs of active, diverse communities. When compared with earlier Triassic deposits, the difference is dramatic. Where once the variety of fish was modest, the late Triassic record reveals an explosion of forms. This burst of diversification is a textbook example of adaptive radiation when new ecological opportunities allow life to branch rapidly into different forms. The floods created habitats where competitors were scarce and resources abundant. Fish filled those empty roles with remarkable speed. Lineages that had been minor players before the rains suddenly expanded, producing descendants that would persist long after the skies cleared. Among them were early relatives of groups that still swim in our waters today. Some fossils preserve details so fine that they capture not just the skeletons, but the impressions of soft tissues, giving glimpses of fins and body outlines. These fossils tell us that fish of the Carnian seas and rivers were not only abundant, but also varied in shape and size, from tiny forms that darted through reeds to larger hunters that prowled open waters. Each new adaptation was a key to survival in a landscape where nothing stayed the same for long. In the larger story of the Triassic, fish stand out as beneficiaries of the storm. While land animals struggled with dwindling oxygen and collapsing food chains, fish expanded into a watery realm that grew larger with every flood. Their fossils remind us that even in times of upheaval, opportunities emerge for those able to move with the currents. The rains that drowned the land became, for them, a vast invitation to spread, diversify, and carve new branches on the tree of life. As the rains poured year after year, It was not only the forests and animals that felt the weight of the storm. The very skin of the earth began to wash away. Soil, that fragile layer built grain by grain over ages, was stripped from the land in an unending cascade. What had once been fertile ground, rich with nutrients to support life, became bare and exhausted, swept into rivers and carried toward the sea. Soil forms slowly. Over centuries and millennia, rocks break down into minerals, organic matter builds as plants live and die, and microbes weave the mixture together into a living foundation. But in the age of eternal storms, this delicate balance collapsed. Rain fell with such persistence that even the strongest soils could not hold. Water carved into hillsides and plains, dragging silt and clay into churning rivers. Each flood tore away what little remained of the land's fertility. This stripping of nutrients had consequences that rippled through ecosystems. Plants depend on soil not only as an anchor, but as a reservoir of minerals and energy. Without those nutrients, forests withered. Grasses and shrubs struggled to take root in the thin layers that remained. Even hardy swamp plants, which could tolerate standing water, were weakened by the loss of fertile ground. When plant life faltered, the animals that relied on it soon followed, and whole communities unraveled. The collapse of fertile soils also reshaped the way landscapes looked. Plains that once supported forests became open wetlands or stagnant floodplains. Valleys that had been cradles of diversity filled with sediment, burying what lived there before. The earth itself seemed to dissolve under the relentless water, transforming into a softer, more transient world where stability was rare. In the fossil record, these changes are written clearly in the layers of ancient soils, or paleosols. Geologists studying Triassic sediments find horizons where soil profiles are interrupted, cut through by coarse deposits left by catastrophic floods. In these places, traces of roots end abruptly, as if torn from the ground. Horizons rich in organic matter vanish, replaced by sterile sands and clays. It is as though the book of the land's history was ripped apart, each page blurred by water before the next could be written. In some layers, bands of red and gray clay mark repeated cycles of saturation and drying, evidence that soils were waterlogged again and again. Elsewhere, geologists find thick deposits of silt and fine sand carried from far away and piled into new floodplains. These washouts show how erosion linked distant regions, connecting mountain slopes, lowland valleys, and coastal zones in one vast system of loss. Each storm moved more of the land toward the sea, feeding sediment into basins that still preserve the memory of that drowned age. The loss of soil did more than starve plants. It also stripped away the foundation for entire food webs. Animals that grazed on vegetation found less to eat. Insects that relied on decaying matter faced scarcity when fertile ground was gone. Even predators, higher in the chain, were affected as their prey dwindled. The collapse of soils created a chain reaction, one that echoed across every level of life. Yet, in this destruction, the earth was also remaking itself. New layers of sediment became the canvas for future ecosystems. Each flood laid down fresh deposits, which in time would harden into rock. Within those rocks, fossils of plants and animals would be preserved, silent witnesses to the upheaval. The very washouts that destroyed life also created the records that allow us to understand it now. Seen through deep time, the endless rain was not only a storm above, but a force that peeled away the living surface of the earth. Soil, the quiet partner of life, was lost again and again, reshaping the balance of survival. In its absence, ecosystems faltered, and the memory of stability slipped away into the churning waters. In the soaked landscapes of the Carnian world, Survival was not only about finding a refuge or waiting for better days. For many species, it depended on the ability to change from within. Life carries in its very code the ability to adapt, to bend without breaking, and in times of extreme stress, this flexibility is revealed most clearly. Genetic plasticity is a quiet force. It is the capacity of organisms to shift their traits in response to challenges without needing countless generations of slow evolution. Sometimes this happens through small genetic variations already present in a population. At other times, it is guided by epigenetic changes, subtle switches that turn genes on or off depending on the environment. In a world of endless rain, these hidden mechanisms became lifelines. Plants, especially, leaned on this plasticity. Under heavy cloud cover and waterlogged soils, those that could alter their growth strategies endured where others perished. Some produced broader leaves to catch what little light filtered through. Others reduced their height, hugging the ground where stability was greater and resources more easily gathered. Seeds that sprouted in poor conditions could activate dormant genetic instructions, adjusting metabolism to cope with low oxygen in the soil. Fossil pollen and plant impressions suggest rapid turnovers in species, a sign that those capable of quick adjustments were the ones that carried forward. Animals, too, showed this capacity. Amphibians, in particular, displayed a wide range of tolerances. Their bodies could shift developmental pathways depending on water availability or temperature, allowing some populations to breed in new habitats or shorten their life cycles to match uncertain seasons. Even small invertebrates, like insects and worms, had built-in flexibility. Many could cycle rapidly through generations, which meant that tiny genetic advantages spread quickly, helping them keep pace with the changing world. Epigenetic responses likely played an unseen but powerful role. Modern research shows that plants under flooding stress can silence certain genes while activating others that support survival, such as those that improve tolerance to low oxygen or enable energy use from alternative sources. These changes do not alter the DNA sequence itself, but adjust how it is read, like turning dials on a machine to suit different conditions. It is possible that during the millions of years of rain, similar processes helped organisms persist through fluctuating challenges, allowing them to survive long enough for more permanent genetic changes to take root. The fossil record cannot capture epigenetic changes directly, but it does reveal their effects. Patterns of sudden adaptation, bursts of diversity, and survival of lineages that seemed unlikely all suggest that hidden flexibility played a role. When we see small plants thriving in layers where larger trees vanished, or particular fish species expanding into new habitats when others collapsed, we are glimpsing the outcome of this bending without breaking. Looking to the modern world provides clues to how this worked. Today, plants like rice can endure long floods by activating specific genes that allow their stems to elongate rapidly, pushing leaves above the water. Others, like certain lotus species, maintain internal air channels that let oxygen reach their submerged roots. Animals, too, demonstrate resilience. Some amphibians can adjust their physiology to low oxygen ponds, while fish in floodplains shift their breeding cycles to match seasonal waters. These living examples echo what must have taken place in the Triassic rains, showing how life can respond swiftly when the environment demands it. Genetic plasticity is not a guarantee of survival, but it is a powerful tool. In a time when landscapes changed faster than most species could migrate, and when resources vanished in sudden collapses, those that could bend their biology found paths forward. Each adjustment, no matter how small, was a chance to hold on through the storm. In this way, the fabric of life revealed its resilience, not in strength that resisted change, but in flexibility that embraced it. In the drowned Triassic landscapes, when great forests collapsed and giants faltered, survival often belonged to the smallest and most overlooked creatures. The worms that tunneled unseen through the mud, the insects that darted between decaying plants, and the mollusks that clung to the edges of waterways all found ways to thrive in a world of endless rain. Their success was not built on size or strength, but on adaptability, resilience, and the quiet advantage of reproducing quickly in unstable environments. Worms were among the unsung engineers of this rain-soaked earth. Even when soils lost their fertility and floods stripped nutrients away, worms persisted in the saturated ground. Their simple bodies were well suited to a life of constant damp, and their burrowing helped oxygenate the waterlogged soils, creating tiny niches where plant roots could take hold. By breaking down organic matter, worms kept nutrients cycling in places where the usual balance of soil life had been destroyed. Though no towering skeletons preserve their presence, trace fossils, burrows etched into ancient sediments, reveal that they continued their quiet work beneath the storm. Insects also endured, though the conditions reshaped their world. Some lineages struggled in the sodden forests, but others found opportunity in the chaos. Rotting vegetation provided food, and swamps offered endless breeding grounds. Certain insects could complete their life cycles in weeks, allowing populations to recover and expand even after setbacks. With every generation, small adaptations accumulated, helping them cope with low oxygen soils, heavy humidity, and shifting food sources. Fossilized impressions of wings and exoskeletons in Triassic deposits show that insects remained abundant during these difficult ages, carrying forward the legacy of their resilience. Mollusks, both on land and in water, also became emblematic survivors. In flooded rivers and coastal zones, bivalves and snails endured salinity shifts that many larger marine organisms could not tolerate. Their shells offered protection from unstable conditions, and their simple feeding strategies allowed them to survive on detritus and microscopic algae washed in by the floods. Freshwater mollusks found homes in the newly formed lakes and floodplains, taking advantage of habitats that shifted as the waters rose and fell. Fossil shells, often found in thick layers, bear witness to their persistence, scattered like quiet markers of life holding on through turmoil. The survival of invertebrates was closely tied to their ability to reproduce rapidly. Unlike the slow cycles of larger animals, which required years to raise a single generation, worms, insects, and many mollusks multiplied quickly. Each new generation was a chance to adapt, to test different strategies in the face of a changing world. Insects, in particular, could produce vast numbers of offspring, ensuring that even if many perished in floods or storms, enough survived to carry the lineage forward. This constant renewal created resilience at a scale larger creatures could not match. Invertebrates also played roles that extended far beyond their own survival. Worms enriched soils, insects pollinated and decomposed plants, and mollusks filtered waters, all of them helping to stabilize ecosystems in quiet ways. Their persistence provided the scaffolding upon which other life forms could rebuild once the rains finally began to ease. Without their cycles of feeding, burrowing, and reproducing, the drowned world would have been even more barren. Fossil evidence supports their resilience in striking ways. In layers that show the collapse of forests and the decline of giants, the remains of invertebrates continue steadily. Tiny wing cases, shells, and burrows appear again and again in Triassic sediments, showing that even as larger animals disappeared, these small survivors never abandoned the stage. Their constancy is a reminder that the foundation of ecosystems often rests on the smallest of lives. In the grand sweep of Earth's story, it was not always the most powerful that endured. During the endless rains, worms, insects, and mollusks thrived quietly in the soaked soils and flooded waters, proving that sometimes survival belongs to those who live small, reproduce quickly, and adapt without hesitation. The endless rains did not only transform the land, they reached outward, spilling from swollen rivers into the seas, carrying with them silt, minerals, and fresh water in such vast quantities that the oceans themselves began to change. The balance of salt and fresh water, which had held steady for ages, tilted suddenly under the weight of runoff. Coastal waters became diluted, their salinity dropping in ways that tested the limits of marine life. For many creatures, salt levels are not just a background condition, they are the framework that allows their bodies to function. Too little salt, and cells swell with water; too much, and they shrivel. When rain-fed rivers poured endlessly into the seas, the balance tipped toward dilution. Fish and mollusks adapted to narrow salinity ranges struggled, and corals, already stressed by sediment washed from the land, faltered in the changing chemistry. In some regions, entire communities of marine animals disappeared. Yet survival did not vanish completely. Pockets of resilience appeared in places where conditions were more stable. In deeper offshore waters, where the influx of fresh water had less reach, marine ecosystems found refuge. Species that could tolerate wide swings in salinity gained an advantage, filling niches left vacant by others. Some fish, already skilled at living in estuaries and coastal shallows, expanded their range. Their ability to move between salt and fresh water gave them access to new territories in the storm-altered seas. The mixing of fresh and salt water also changed how the oceans layered themselves. Normally, the sea circulates as denser, saltier water sinks and lighter, fresher water rises, creating a vertical conveyor that helps distribute oxygen and nutrients. But during the millions of years of rain, this balance was disrupted. Freshwater runoff spread like a blanket across the surface, while saltier water below remained trapped. The layers stopped mixing, leaving the deep waters starved of oxygen. This stratification had profound consequences. Animals that lived in the depths found themselves suffocating as oxygen dwindled. Dead zones spread, where life could no longer survive. Meanwhile, the surface layers, rich in nutrients from the land, sometimes bloomed with algae, their populations fed by the floods of material washed into the sea. These blooms could provide food for some, but when they collapsed, the decaying masses further drained oxygen from the water. It was a cycle of abundance and suffocation, repeating again and again in the shadow of the rains. The evidence of this rewriting of the oceans is captured in stone. In Triassic marine sediments, geologists find layers rich in organic matter, dark shales that signal times when oxygen was too scarce to allow full decay. These rocks often contain the remains of microscopic plankton, but lack the fossils of larger bottom-dwelling animals, a sign that the seafloor had become uninhabitable. Chemical traces within these layers, such as the ratios of certain isotopes, confirm that the oceans were stratified, their chemistry turned upside down by the floods. In other places, the fossil record tells a different story. There are pockets where diverse marine communities survived, suggesting that not all waters succumbed to suffocation. Coral fragments, shell beds, and fish remains in certain deposits show that in localized regions, ecosystems adapted and endured. These areas may have been buffered by currents, geology, or simply chance, creating small islands of stability in a world otherwise overwhelmed by change. The rains did not erase the oceans, but they reshaped them in ways that tested the boundaries of marine life. For some, the altered seas were fatal. For others, they were invitations to expand, adapt, and survive. In the silence of the rocks, we see both collapse and endurance, reminders of how delicate the balance of the seas can be when the world above shifts into extremes. The endless rains did not just reshape landscapes and oceans, they tore apart the delicate threads of food chains that held life together. Every living thing depends on a flow of energy, passed step by step from plants to herbivores to predators. When storms broke the balance, each link of that chain began to strain, and in many places, the entire structure collapsed. Specialized predators were among the first to suffer. These were animals that had evolved to hunt particular prey or to live in narrow ecological niches. In stable times, specialization can be an advantage. A hunter that knows exactly what it feeds on can thrive when its prey is abundant. But in the drowned Triassic world, stability vanished. Herbivores declined when plants failed, and with them, the predators that relied on them. Fossils of certain carnivorous reptiles from this age grow scarce, suggesting that lineages finely tuned to one way of life could not bend to the new reality. Insects that depended on specific plants struggled when those plants disappeared, and so did the creatures that hunted them. Fish species that fed on coral reef communities faltered as reefs collapsed under sediment and salinity stress. Even giant amphibians, once rulers of rivers and swamps, dwindled as the prey they had relied on vanished. The fossil record captures these silences. Bones of some groups become rare or vanish entirely from layers that record the wettest intervals, a reflection of ecosystems unraveling link by link. Yet not all life was so rigid. Generalists, species that could eat many things and tolerate shifting conditions, rose to prominence. In the fossil record, we see the expansion of fish with broad diets, insects that could adapt to multiple plants, and scavengers that fed on whatever the storms delivered. These flexible survivors often thrived in places where specialists could not endure. Their ability to exploit a wide range of resources gave them the resilience needed in a world where nothing was predictable. The dominance of generalists simplified ecosystems. Instead of intricate webs with countless interdependent strands, communities became more streamlined. Energy flowed through fewer pathways, often concentrated in hardy species able to take advantage of whatever food was available. Fossil assemblages from this period reflect this simplicity. Instead of the wide diversity seen in earlier times, layers often contain just a handful of species repeated in abundance. Shell beds dominated by only a few mollusks, insect deposits where just one or two forms prevail, or fish remains showing the success of adaptable lineages, are all echoes of ecosystems pared down to their essentials. This simplification carried its own consequences. Ecosystems built on a small number of species are fragile in different ways, easily toppled if those few are lost. Yet, they also reveal the extraordinary persistence of life. Even when complexity was stripped away, even when the chains of energy seemed on the verge of breaking completely, the generalists kept them alive, holding open the possibility of recovery once the rains ceased. There is a quiet story in these fossils, one that tells us how life responds to upheaval. The grand variety of the Triassic world shrank under the weight of the storm, but not into silence. Instead, it contracted into survival mode, simplifying, paring back, relying on those with the widest appetites and the greatest flexibility. It was a narrowing of options, a tightening of the weave, yet still enough to keep the pulse of ecosystems alive. The endless rain put food chains under siege, but the resilience of generalists ensured that not all links snapped. In their persistence, the foundations for future recovery were quietly preserved, waiting for the skies to clear. As the rain poured year after year, the lowlands of the world became unrecognizable. Valleys drowned, forests collapsed into swamps, and floodplains stretched as far as the eye could see. For many creatures, survival meant seeking higher ground. Mountains, ridges, and elevated plateaus became lifelines in a planet otherwise sinking beneath the storms. High ground offered more than just escape from the water. On slopes and peaks, soils were less likely to be stripped completely, and plants could still anchor themselves in rocky crevices. While the plains below were reduced to nutrient-poor mud, the uplands held patches of stability where seeds could take root and grow. Here, away from the constant floods, new ecosystems formed, often smaller and more fragile, but vital nonetheless. Animals, too, found refuge in these elevated spaces. Fossils discovered in upland deposits tell us that reptiles, amphibians, and even small mammal-like creatures sought safety in mountain corridors. Tracks preserved in stone record their movements along ridges, showing that they migrated through these landscapes in search of food and shelter. Some fossils capture the remains of entire communities, frozen in layers of sediment that settled when the storms briefly eased. They are echoes of survival written into the rocks of ancient highlands. The evidence of these upland sanctuaries is striking. In several Triassic deposits, paleontologists find concentrations of fossils that differ from those in lowland sediments. Instead of the dominance of swamp-adapted species, the upland records show a mixture of forms, suggesting that these areas acted as crossroads where species from different environments met. These mountain zones may have functioned as survival corridors, narrow bands of habitability linking scattered populations across continents. The geology of these highlands also tells part of the story. Upland rocks preserve soils less disturbed by flooding, with intact root traces and pollen deposits that point to persistent vegetation. These are places where forests managed to cling to life, even as their lowland counterparts were drowned. Some layers contain pollen from plants that do not appear in floodplain sediments of the same age, evidence that unique plant communities were sustained in elevated terrain. For animals, mountains offered not only refuge, but also pathways. As valleys filled with water, movement through lowland regions became nearly impossible. Elevated ridges created corridors for migration, allowing species to disperse and find new territories. Fossil trackways in these zones suggest repeated journeys, lines of footprints etched into once soft mud that later hardened into stone. Each step was part of a quiet exodus, driven by the search for stability in a shifting world. These survival corridors were fragile, and not all who sought them endured. Competition in these restricted spaces must have been intense, with predators and prey confined to narrow strips of habitable land. Yet the very existence of these pathways meant that some lineages could persist, bridging the gap between collapse and recovery. Without them, isolation might have driven many species to extinction. The story written in these mountain deposits is one of resilience in unlikely places. While the rains reshaped seas and swamps below, the uplands preserved pieces of the ancient world. They became refuges where plants, animals, and even microbes could continue their cycles until the climate began to settle. The fossils they left behind whisper of persistence on high ground, of survival fought not in abundance, but in the thin safety of elevation. Amid the unrelenting storms of the Carnian world, When skies stayed heavy with rain and valleys drowned beneath water, there were moments when fire broke through the gray. Volcanic eruptions punctuated the endless downpour, splitting the landscape with glowing rivers of molten rock and clouds of ash that reached far into the heavens. On the surface, these eruptions might have seemed like yet another catastrophe, but hidden within their destruction were fleeting windows of survival. When volcanoes erupted, they cleared away the rain-soaked vegetation, exposing stretches of bare ground. Though dangerous at first, these newly opened lands were among the few places not buried under swamps and floodplains. Lava flows hardened into rocky expanses that shed water quickly, creating rare dry refuges in a world otherwise saturated. Life that could not endure the constant damp sometimes found a fragile foothold on these higher, newly formed grounds. For plants, especially, the ash that followed eruptions provided a gift disguised as devastation. Volcanic ash is rich in minerals, carrying nutrients such as potassium, phosphorus, and trace elements essential for growth. In the wet Triassic world, where fertile soils were constantly stripped away by erosion, these sudden deposits of ash created fresh, nutrient-rich layers. Within years, and sometimes even months, pioneering plants colonized the volcanic landscapes. Ferns, mosses, and spore-producing plants were usually the first to take hold, their tiny reproductive structures drifting easily on the wind and settling into cracks between cooling rocks. Soon after, hardier shrubs and trees followed, creating islands of green in a drowned and gray world. Fossil records provide clues to this cycle of destruction and regrowth. In certain sediment layers that mark volcanic activity, paleontologists find sudden bursts of plant spores and pollen, far denser than in surrounding deposits. These spikes suggest that eruptions triggered waves of new growth, periods when plants flourished in freshly enriched soils. Alongside them appear fossils of insects and small animals, hinting at the rapid return of ecosystems. These temporary havens may have served as stepping stones, allowing species to survive until broader conditions improved. For animals, the dry refuges created by eruptions offered more than just food. They provided landscapes with firmer ground, where bodies did not sink into constant mud and where burrows could be dug without collapsing. Trackways preserved in volcanic sediments show that reptiles and amphibians explored these spaces, leaving behind footprints etched into ash that later hardened into stone. These traces tell us that life quickly reclaimed these environments, turning devastation into opportunity. There were risks as well. Volcanic gases and the initial heat of eruptions killed many creatures caught in their path. Ash clouds could darken the sky even further, worsening the dim light that already plagued photosynthesis. But once the ash settled and the lava cooled, these regions became rare landscapes of renewal. In a sense, volcanoes acted like resets, wiping clean waterlogged ground and replacing it with conditions where new growth could take root. The connection between eruptions and bursts of life is seen again and again in the fossil record. After layers rich in volcanic deposits, scientists often find increases in fossil diversity, from plants to invertebrates to small vertebrates. These are the echoes of recovery, tied directly to the nutrients and dry ground volcanoes delivered. Even in the middle of the rain-soaked Triassic, fire created doors for life to pass through, doors that may have been critical in preserving lineages that would otherwise have been lost. The paradox is striking. In an age when water seemed to rule, it was sometimes fire that made survival possible. Volcanoes, fierce and destructive, also carved out sanctuaries, giving life brief but vital chances to regroup and endure. In the drowned world of endless rain, where soils thinned, forests collapsed, and food chains faltered, survival often came not through strength alone, but through cooperation. Life leaned on partnerships, some visible, many microscopic, that quietly sustained entire ecosystems when resources seemed almost gone. These relationships, forged long before the storms, became lifelines during the Carnian Pluvial Event, proving that resilience can emerge from working together. Among the most vital of these partnerships were the connections between plants and fungi. Beneath the flooded soils, invisible networks of fungal threads reached out, binding themselves to the roots of plants. These networks are known as mycorrhizae, and they act as extensions of the root systems, drawing in nutrients and water that plants cannot reach on their own. In return, plants share sugars made through photosynthesis. During times of stress, when the rain diluted nutrients and oxygen slipped away from the soils, these fungal allies gave plants a better chance of holding on. Fossilized root systems from Triassic sediments show evidence of these connections, suggesting that even then, plants survived not in isolation, but as part of a hidden partnership stretching through the earth. This quiet exchange kept plants alive in places where they would otherwise have perished. The fungi could tap into minerals locked in rock fragments carried by floods, releasing phosphorus and other elements critical for plant survival. Even when light was scarce and photosynthesis weakened, plants supported their fungal partners enough to keep the relationship alive, and in turn, the fungi sustained the plants through scarcity. These underground networks acted almost like community lifelines, redistributing resources between plants, allowing weaker individuals to draw support from stronger ones. In a storm-battered world, cooperation beneath the soil made the difference between collapse and persistence. Animals too relied on microscopic partnerships. Within the guts of many herbivores lived symbiotic microbes that helped digest food in ways their own bodies could not. In saturated landscapes where plants were stressed, rotting, or nutrient poor, these microbial partners became critical. They broke down tough plant fibers, released energy from otherwise indigestible matter, and allowed animals to survive on diets that would have been impossible without them. Fossil evidence does not capture microbes directly, but isotopic studies of ancient bones suggest shifts in diet consistent with heavy reliance on tough vegetation, the kind only made usable through microbial help. Even carnivores, indirectly, benefited from these partnerships. The prey they hunted had survived thanks to microbial allies, keeping the flow of energy moving up the chain. In this way, entire ecosystems leaned on symbiosis, invisible threads holding life together when every other support seemed to fail. The fossil record preserves hints of these exchanges in subtle ways. Geochemical analysis of sediments and plant remains reveals isotope ratios that suggest nutrient cycling between fungi and plants. These chemical fingerprints are silent signatures of cooperation. In some layers, unusual distributions of carbon and nitrogen point to the recycling of resources through symbiotic pathways rather than direct uptake from the soil. Such evidence shows us that partnerships left measurable marks, even when their participants are long gone. Symbiosis also extended beyond survival in the moment. It allowed ecosystems to remain interconnected, keeping them from fragmenting completely. When floods washed across valleys, when forests fell and swamps spread, the cooperative systems beneath the surface carried forward. They gave continuity to life in an age of interruption. Without these exchanges, the rains might have stripped Earth even more bare. There is a quiet beauty in this story. In an era defined by storms and scarcity, survival was not always a battle. It was often a dialogue, a sharing of strengths across species, written not in towering bones or dramatic fossils, but in delicate threads of fungi, in microscopic communities within guts, and in chemical echoes preserved in stone. These partnerships were the anchors of endurance, invisible but essential, keeping the living world tethered while the storms reshaped the planet above. For millions of years before the great rains, forests had reigned supreme. Towering conifers rose like spires across the Triassic world. Seed ferns with their broad fronds stretched toward the light, and ginkgo-like trees spread their canopies into steady green roof lines. These were the kingdoms of stability, anchored by deep root systems and rich soils, feeding diverse networks of animals, insects, and microbes. They had endured droughts and shifting seasons, holding the land together in webs of shade and shelter. When the storms came and refused to end, it was these long-established forests that bore the brunt of the flood. Rain did not simply wash the leaves from their branches. It rewrote the very conditions that forests needed to exist. Roots that once drank easily from the ground began to drown in saturated soils. Oxygen, essential for root survival, was replaced by stagnant water that filled every pore of the earth. Trees that had endured centuries were suddenly smothered. Their trunks softened, bark peeled away, and fungi found easy purchase in tissues already weakened by constant wetness. The once sturdy pillars of the forest became fragile, collapsing under their own weight. The fossil record shows the speed of this collapse. In sediments laid down during the Carnian Pluvial Event, layers of pollen grains capture a story of upheaval. Before the rains, the pollen of gymnosperms and seed ferns dominates, a signature of forests that stretched from horizon to horizon. But in the layers deposited after the storms took hold, those signals all but vanish. Instead, sudden surges of fern spores appear, thin, delicate markers of opportunistic plants rushing into the space left behind. This shift was not subtle. It unfolded in a geological instant, a dramatic turnover that transformed the land from canopied forests into open, saturated ground. The ecological void this created was immense. Where once roots had anchored soils, floods now carried sediments into lowlands, choking valleys with mud and silt. Forest floors that had been shaded and dry became expanses of standing water. Fallen trunks lay like scattered bones, sometimes preserved in flood-buried sediments, sometimes rotting completely, leaving only ghostly impressions in stone. What had been networks of life became ghost landscapes of decay forests, stilled into silence by the relentless pressure of the sky. Even in their downfall, the great forests left traces of their undoing. Fossilized wood from this period shows clear signs of collapse. Boreholes from insects that burrowed into weakened trunks, fungal filaments woven through the tissues, and cracks where rot had hollowed them from the inside out. These remains speak of ecosystems unraveling, not in slow decline, but in sudden breakage, as if the foundations of land life were swept away by water. Animals tied to these forests faced the same fate. Herbivores that once browsed on conifer needles or fed on seed fern fronds lost their steady food sources. Predators that depended on forest prey struggled as hunting grounds disappeared. Some species dwindled and vanished with the trees, their niches gone. Others wandered outward, searching for scraps of stability in the fractured landscapes. The collapse was not just botanical. It rippled through every layer of the food web. The pollen record reveals this pattern again and again. Fern spikes appear in thin bands of sediment, showing moments when, after each storm surge or flood event, ferns exploded into dominance. They were quick colonizers, seizing every patch of disturbed ground. Yet the towering forest trees rarely returned. Their pollen remained sparse, their rain broken. What emerged in their place was not continuity, but a patchwork of open wetlands, scattered groves, and unstable soils. The fall of the forest kingdoms was one of Earth's most striking transitions. Vast, towering ecosystems that had defined the land for millions of years were drowned and silenced. What replaced them was unfamiliar and unstable, a world waiting for new opportunists to spread into the void. The drowned root systems, decayed trunks, and sudden disappearance of once dominant pollen grains all testify to a moment when the old order failed, leaving behind landscapes of absence. It was from that emptiness that the next chapter of survival began. In the wake of the storm, when forests fell and ecosystems fractured, there emerged a different kind of survivor. These were not the towering trees or the specialized hunters that had once dominated, but the opportunists, plants and animals that could bend with change, thrive in disturbance, and take advantage of the new, unstable world. While much of life struggled to cling on, these flexible forms spread rapidly, filling the gaps left behind. Opportunistic plants were among the first to claim the new landscapes. In place of forests, ferns surged across open ground, their spores traveling easily on wind and water. They could sprout quickly, maturing in weeks, and send out vast numbers of spores to colonize new patches as soon as they appeared. These plants did not demand stability. They flourished in chaos, turning bare mudflats, floodplains, and lands scoured by erosion into seas of green. Fossil pollen records reveal their dominance, with sudden spikes of fern spores marking the moments when disturbance cleared the stage for them to grow. Other plants with rapid growth and wide tolerances followed. Shrubs with tough seeds, capable of surviving long submersion in water, spread through floodplains. Early conifers, with flexible growth habits, held on in fragmented stands, seeding themselves into whatever dry ground remained. These survivors succeeded not through sheer size or strength, but by reproducing quickly and adapting to whatever conditions the rains created. Animals mirrored this opportunistic strategy. Insects, already thriving in damp, decaying environments, spread widely. Those that could feed on many types of plants or detritus multiplied, outlasting species tied to single food sources. Fossil layers show an abundance of beetles and other generalist insects, their remains preserved in sediments that captured the aftermath of floods. These small creatures became keystones in the simplified food chains, recycling nutrients and sustaining predators that had shifted to broader diets. Among vertebrates, generalist feeders gained the upper hand. Reptiles that could eat plants, insects, and small animals adapted more easily to the changing environment. Their fossils are found in greater numbers than those of highly specialized predators, which dwindled as their prey vanished. Amphibians, too, benefited from their adaptability. Many species could breed in a variety of wet habitats, from swamps to temporary pools left by floods, allowing them to persist even as other creatures faltered. One of the traits that unified these survivors was speed. Fast reproduction meant that setbacks did not wipe them out entirely. A flood might drown a local population, but within a short time, spores, seeds, or offspring from nearby areas could recolonize the space. Another key was flexibility. Opportunists were not tied to narrow diets or specific nesting grounds. They ate what was available, grew where conditions allowed, and shifted quickly when circumstances changed. The fossil record reflects these advantages. In sediments from the Carnian Pluvial Event, paleontologists find patterns of dominance by lineages known for adaptability. Fern spores appear in overwhelming abundance. Insects such as beetles are consistently preserved in great numbers, and reptiles with broad diets left behind more frequent fossil traces than their specialized relatives. These records are not just snapshots of survival, but portraits of opportunism in action, showing how certain traits allowed species to spread widely in unstable times. The rise of opportunists reshaped the ecological map of the Triassic world. Communities became simpler, but they were held together by life forms that excelled at persistence. Each patch of ground, each flooded valley, was quickly claimed by those ready to grow fast, eat broadly, and endure change. While the age of rain toppled giants and silenced specialists, it also opened doors for those who thrived on instability, rewriting the rules of survival in favor of the flexible. When the rains drenched Earth for millions of years, many creatures had no choice but to move. Entire landscapes became unstable, rivers overflowed, and once dependable habitats disappeared underwater. To survive, plants and animals alike turned to migration, a slow and steady flow of life toward whatever drier or more stable ground could be found. Movement became a lifeline, stretching across continents and oceans, etched into the rocks and fossils they left behind. Animals often carried the most visible signs of these journeys. Fossil trackways preserved in ancient mudflats and upland sediments show paths carved by creatures moving across sodden terrain. Lines of footprints from reptiles and amphibians reveal steady progress in one direction, as if entire groups were pushing towards safer land. Some tracks overlap, suggesting waves of movement, generations following the same route over time. These traces are not random wanderings, but quiet evidence of dispersal, of animals seeking refuge from the drowned valleys below. For smaller creatures, migration was not always about great distances, but about constant searching. Amphibians, for example, moved between shrinking pools and temporary wetlands, adjusting their breeding grounds with every shift in the floodwaters. Insects spread rapidly into disturbed habitats, their ability to fly carrying them far beyond the reach of rising rivers. Many reptiles, though slower, found safety along ridges and higher terrain, turning mountains and uplands into living corridors of survival. Each footprint and fossilized trail tells of persistence, of life moving step by step toward continuity. Plants, too, migrated, though their journeys looked different. Seeds became the vessels of movement, carried by water and wind to colonize new places. Floods that stripped soil from one region also carried seeds downstream, depositing them in fresh sediments where life could begin again. The swollen rivers of the Triassic acted like conveyor belts, scattering plant life across vast distances. In some cases, entire mats of vegetation broke free and floated downstream, seeds sprouting as soon as they found solid ground. Spores, even lighter and more abundant, drifted on air currents or rode the spray of rain. Their microscopic size allowed them to travel farther than seeds, reaching uplands, floodplains, and coastal zones alike. Fossil pollen records capture this constant dispersal, with sudden appearances of species in new regions where they had not been recorded before. These shifts are not simply changes in local vegetation, but signs of migration, of plants colonizing fresh lands as old forests drowned. The movement of life left lasting marks in stone. Fossilized soils show the presence of new root systems where old vegetation had collapsed, recording waves of recolonization. Trackways show animals venturing into regions that had once been barren but were made livable by shifting climates. Shell deposits in inland basins hint at aquatic species expanding into waterways that had connected during the floods. Each piece of evidence is a footprint in deep time, recording how migration wove survival into the fabric of the age. Migration was not always successful. Many lineages perished despite their journeys, unable to adapt quickly enough or find suitable ground. Yet others thrived, spreading farther than before. The very instability of the Triassic rains opened new corridors of movement, linking habitats that had once been isolated. Through these connections, genes flowed between populations, strengthening lineages and helping some species endure challenges that might otherwise have ended them. The rains made the earth unpredictable, but migration kept life in motion. It was a strategy not of permanence, but of constant adjustment, a way of following opportunity wherever it appeared. Seeds riding rivers, spores drifting on winds, reptiles leaving their tracks in mud, amphibians shifting from one pool to another. All of these movements were quiet acts of persistence. They turned survival into a journey, one that carried life forward across a drowned and restless world. When Earth slipped beneath the weight of unending rain, it was not only survival strategies that shifted. The pressure of constant change reached into the very heart of evolution, pushing species to adapt faster than ever before. Environments that transformed in years instead of millennia created conditions where life could no longer rely on slow, steady progress. Instead, small populations fractured, diversified, and gave rise to sudden bursts of new forms. It was an age of microevolutionary explosions, where stress acted as a crucible for innovation. The endless rains reshaped habitats so frequently that no ecosystem remained stable for long. Valleys that one year held forests might flood into swamps the next. Shallow seas expanded and then retreated, leaving behind mudflats and inland lakes. For the creatures living within these shifting worlds, survival meant constant adjustment. Populations became fragmented, cut off from one another by floodwaters, erosion, or new landscapes. Isolation is one of evolution's most powerful engines. Once separated, groups of the same species begin to drift genetically, each adapting to its own pocket of environment. Fossil evidence shows this fragmentation clearly. In some Triassic deposits, species appear in great numbers for a short interval, only to be replaced by slightly different forms in the next layer above. These rapid turnovers suggest that populations were splitting and evolving faster than usual, their lineages branching into new directions as the storms forced separation. Instead of long, gradual transitions, the record shows bursts, as though nature was running countless small experiments at once. One striking example comes from the fossil record of fish. In sediments laid down during the peak of the rains, scientists find multiple, closely related species coexisting in the same regions. Subtle differences in body shape or feeding structures suggest they had adapted to slightly different niches within the unstable waterways. Some were streamlined for open channels, others flatter for life in shallow plant-choked pools. These differences may have developed in only a few generations, each variation giving one group an advantage in its corner of the flooded world. In plants, too, bursts of diversification appear in the fossil record. Pollen grains from this time show sudden spikes of variety, with new forms emerging in quick succession. These changes mirror the fragmented habitats of the Triassic, where small plant populations found themselves isolated on uplands, volcanic soils, or shifting floodplains. Each group adapted in its own way, creating a patchwork of diversity recorded in microscopic fossils that still drift in ancient sediments. These bursts were not always successful in the long run. Many experimental lineages vanished as quickly as they appeared, unable to withstand the next swing in climate or the next catastrophic flood. Yet their brief existence shows us how life tested the limits of possibility. In the fossil record, they appear like sparks, bright, fleeting, and numerous, each one a trial of adaptation under pressure. The process can be thought of as countless natural experiments unfolding across the drowned world. Every isolated valley, every newly formed lake, and every patch of fertile volcanic ash became a laboratory for evolution. In some places, species flourished for a short time before disappearing. In others, new lineages endured, carrying their traits forward into more stable ages. These survivors became the seeds of future biodiversity, their origins rooted in the crucible of storm and flood. The macro patterns left in stone tell us that life during the Carnian Pluvial Event was not static but dynamic, a constant churn of diversification. Where fossils from calmer times often show long periods of stability, the layers of this rain-soaked age reveal rapid pulses of change. It was a world where survival meant more than endurance. It meant the capacity to split, adapt, and reinvent again and again. In the silence of the rocks, these micro-evolutionary explosions remind us that even in chaos, life finds ways to innovate. The rains that seemed to smother the earth were also sculptors, chiseling new forms into existence, many of which would shape the future of ecosystems long after the skies finally cleared. Beneath the storm-filled skies, far from the drowned forests and swollen rivers, another drama unfolded in the shallow seas. Coral reefs, those intricate fortresses built by countless tiny creatures, faced a crisis unlike any they had known before. The endless rains carried torrents of sediment from the land into the oceans. Rivers, swollen and furious, emptied mud, silt, and nutrients into coastal waters, clouding the seas and burying the delicate structures of coral ecosystems. Reefs thrive only when conditions are stable. They need clear waters for sunlight to reach the symbiotic algae living within coral tissues, algae that provide much of the energy corals require to grow. But in the storm-drenched Triassic world, clarity gave way to murk. Sediment hung in suspension, choking the light. Grains of silt settled onto coral colonies, smothering them. Nutrient-rich runoff fueled algal blooms that competed with corals, shading and overwhelming them. For many reef communities, the rain spelled collapse. Fossil evidence captures the scale of this destruction. In Triassic reef deposits, scientists find abrupt breaks in growth patterns. Coral skeletons that had once formed continuous frameworks are interrupted by layers of sediment, evidence of smothering events. Whole sections of reef appear buried, frozen mid-growth, their structures preserved beneath mud and sand. In some places, the once complex ecosystems reduced to rubble, leaving behind only scattered fragments of coral among the sediments. Yet, as with so many parts of life during this age of storms, collapse was not the end. Some corals endured, finding ways to adapt to the new conditions. Species with thicker tissues or more efficient methods of shedding sediment survived where delicate forms perished. Corals that could tolerate fluctuations in salinity and light gained an advantage. These survivors gradually rebuilt, forming smaller, hardier reefs in pockets where conditions allowed. Fossil records show signs of this renewal. After layers marking destruction, later sediments contain evidence of coral regrowth. New generations of reef builders appear, sometimes dominated by different species than before. The diversity of corals may have narrowed, but those that remained developed new tolerances. They learned to endure waters more turbid, more unstable than their ancestors had faced. This adaptability gave them a foothold, allowing reefs to recover, though in altered forms. These reef systems were not as elaborate as the great structures seen in earlier or later ages. Instead, they were patchier, scattered across shallow seas rather than forming vast continuous barriers. Still, They supported marine life, offering shelter and feeding grounds to fish, mollusks, and invertebrates. Fossil assemblages from these reefs reveal communities of survivors, species that shifted their habits to live among smaller, more fragmented reef habitats. The story written in the rocks is one of cycles: collapse, burial, and renewal, repeated again and again during the rains. Each flood brought devastation, yet each pause allowed life to push back. Over time, the reefs of the Carnian world became testaments to endurance. They remind us that even ecosystems as fragile as corals can adapt when pressed to their limits, reshaping themselves into forms that match the world around them. The endurance of these reefs was more than survival. It was a quiet act of persistence that laid the groundwork for the dazzling coral ecosystems that would flourish millions of years later. Without the resilience of those Triassic survivors, the oceans might have been far poorer in the ages that followed. Their skeletons, preserved in stone, are not just relics of destruction, but also monuments to renewal. The silent memory of life bending, reshaping, and holding on through the storm. The rains that had poured for millions of years did not end in a sudden silence. There was no single day when the clouds broke, no instant when sunlight returned in full strength. Instead, the planet moved slowly, almost reluctantly, toward balance. The storms weakened by degrees, their violence softening as the great forces that had fueled them began to fade. Deep within layers of stone, the record of this gradual shift can still be read. Sediment cores, drawn from ancient basins, show rhythmic changes that tell a story of skies beginning to clear. Where thick beds of silt and clay once stacked in endless succession, lighter layers appear, marked by grains of sand and fragments of soil washed in from drier landscapes. The endless rhythm of flood upon flood gave way to intervals of stability, as if the earth were learning once again to rest. Geologists study the chemistry of these layers and find signals of the climate's slow recovery. Ratios of carbon isotopes, which had swung wildly during the height of the storms, began to settle. These chemical fingerprints suggest that volcanic outpourings of greenhouse gases eased, their fury spent after years of eruption. With fewer emissions to trap heat and moisture, the atmosphere calmed. Rainfall declined, not all at once, but in fits and starts, until the cycles of cloud and sun began to find a new rhythm. In places where sediments preserve ancient soils, signs of drying can be traced. Horizons rich with iron oxides show that oxygen returned to the ground as it hardened, no longer smothered under constant floods. Plant roots left impressions in these soils, evidence of vegetation beginning to take hold again, spreading cautiously into spaces once drowned by water. The very structure of the land, long reshaped by torrents, began to stabilize. Slopes held together by returning greenery. The oceans, too, carry the signature of this shift. Fossil plankton communities, which had been stressed by the constant influx of fresh water and sediment, show signs of renewal. After long intervals of disruption, species diversity increased once more. Algae that had struggled in the dim light of storm-filled skies found steadier conditions in which to flourish. Coral reefs, long battered, showed patches of recovery, small but telling markers that the seas were becoming calmer, clearer, and more stable. In the skies, the transition would have been felt in ways almost imperceptible at first. Clouds still lingered, heavy and low, but there were days when they thinned just enough for stronger rays of sunlight to pierce through. Vegetation, long stunted under the dim canopy, would have responded quickly to these small gifts of light, pushing out greener leaves, spreading more broadly across the recovering land. For animals, these glimpses of brightness would have marked the slow return of more predictable cycles, days that no longer blurred endlessly into one another under rain. Even the rivers bore witness to the change. Their currents, once swollen and fierce, began to shrink back into channels closer to their ancient courses. Floodplains still spread wide, but they no longer stretched endlessly to the horizon. In some regions, inland seas receded, leaving behind marshes and fertile lowlands where new ecosystems could take root. Over thousands of years, the memory of a world drowned in water gave way to a planet in which land and sea found a more delicate balance. The fossil record shows that this ending was not uniform across the globe. Some regions remained wet for longer, while others dried sooner, creating a patchwork of climates. But taken together, the evidence is clear. The storm that had defined an age was finally fading. Sediments became less dominated by flood debris. Fossil pollen shows plants returning in greater variety. Ocean chemistry steadied, pointing to a climate that, though still unstable at times, had broken free from the grip of endless rain. The final days of the Carnian storms were not a dramatic finale, but a long exhale, a slow release from the weight of clouds that had blanketed the earth for millions of years. As the atmosphere cleared, sunlight returned more fully, the seasons sharpened, and the rhythms of life regained their strength. The planet had endured its drowning, reshaped by forces of fire and water, and was now preparing to open the next chapter of its history. When the endless rains finally drew back, the world was left scarred yet strangely open. What had once been a planet locked beneath gray skies and swelling floods now began to breathe again. Rivers retreated into their channels, seas calmed, and skies brightened, not with sudden clarity, but with a gradual return of light and rhythm. In that fragile calm, life surged forward. The fossil record reveals this renewal in stunning detail. In layers laid down after the Carnian Pluvial Event, the diversity of species expands dramatically. Where once sediments told a story of struggle and decline, they now burst with signs of adaptive radiation, an evolutionary bloom, as if life had been waiting in the shadows for its moment to return. Plants, freed from the choke of constant storms, spread into new territories with remarkable speed. Ferns carpeted damp soils, conifers stretched upward, and seed plants once more pushed into landscapes that had been stripped bare. Animals responded in equal measure. Amphibians, which had endured the age of rain with mixed fortune, began to thrive again in the wetlands that remained. Reptiles, already experimenting with new forms, diversified into shapes that hinted at the coming dominance of the dinosaurs. Fossil trackways show an increasing variety of body sizes and movement styles, from small scuttling creatures to larger predators reclaiming their role in the food chain. Each footprint pressed into soft mud tells a story of survival translated into expansion. In the seas, the rebound was just as striking. Coral reefs, battered by sediment and stress during the storms, began to recover. Fossil corals show lineages that endured by evolving new tolerances, adapting to fluctuations in temperature and clarity. These survivors laid the groundwork for reef ecosystems that would once again become centers of biodiversity. Fish, too, show evidence of rapid diversification. Where waterways had once been limited to hardy generalists, a wealth of new species emerged, each finding opportunity in the freshly balanced aquatic world. Wetlands played a special role in this great rebound. During the storm years, they had been sprawling, suffocating expanses that dominated entire landscapes. But as the rains eased, many of these wetlands shrank into smaller, more stable habitats. Instead of endless marshes stretching across continents, there were now pockets of balance, river deltas rich with vegetation, seasonal floodplains that nurtured new growth. and lakes ringed with plants that supported thriving insect and amphibian life. Fossil pollen records show this transformation clearly, with an increase in plant variety that marks the transition from drowned monotony to resilient diversity. The adaptability of life seems almost poetic in these records. Stress had not only killed but also reshaped the survivors. Species that could adjust quickly to change found themselves with vast new ecological opportunities once the worst had passed. This pattern is written into the bones of ancient reptiles, into the shells of mollusks, and into the spores and seeds preserved in mudstone. What might seem like chaos in the short term became, over longer spans, the raw material for explosive creativity in evolution. Even in the smallest details, the signs of rebound are clear. Insects, with their ability to reproduce rapidly and explore new niches, flourished in the renewed landscapes. Beetles, dragonflies, and early relatives of modern flies spread across both wetlands and forests. Worms and mollusks expanded again into soils that had regained fertility after years of erosion and washout. Their quiet activity of burrowing and feeding helped recycle nutrients, making ecosystems even more resilient as they grew. What emerges from this record is a sense of momentum. Life did not simply recover to its former state, but expanded into forms and functions that had never existed before. The stress of the rain-soaked age had pruned ecosystems severely, but the clearing away of old structures created room for new ones. Evolution responded by branching rapidly, experimenting with new adaptations and strategies. In this way, catastrophe became the catalyst for renewal. As the wetlands shrank, forests returned, and seas stabilized, the world looked profoundly different than it had before the long storms. It was not a return to what once was, but the birth of something entirely new. In the late Triassic landscapes that followed, the stage was set for one of Earth's most extraordinary chapters, when dinosaurs began their rise, and the planet entered a fresh balance shaped by the memory of floods. When we look back at the rains of the Carnian Pluvial Event, we are not only peering into a distant chapter of Earth's history, we are also catching glimpses of patterns that echo into our own time. The planet may feel different now, with our cities, machines, and technology, but the same natural forces still govern its rhythms. The atmosphere, the oceans, and the thin living layer of soil and plants respond to stress in ways that echo across millions of years. Today, scientists are watching rainfall patterns change around the world. In some regions, storms are growing more intense, dropping more water in a few days than entire seasons once delivered. In others, the rains do not stop, swelling rivers until they spill into farmlands and homes. These shifts remind researchers of what happened long ago when a flood of greenhouse gases and volcanic upheaval rewrote the climate. The past shows that extreme rainfall is not just a local inconvenience. It is a planetary force that can alter landscapes, test the survival of species, and redraw ecosystems. The fossil record of the ancient rain world demonstrates how quickly water can remake the face of the earth. Mountains were carved into valleys, forests drowned into swamps, and seas swelled far inland. When modern scientists see rivers in the present tearing away farmland, or coastal marshes disappearing under rising seas, they hear faint reminders of that earlier transformation. What feels sudden to us today is a pattern Earth has carried before, though now accelerated by human activity. There is comfort and caution in how ecosystems responded to the endless storms of the past. Comfort, because life did not vanish completely. Seeds endured in hidden places, microbes continued their work, and opportunistic species spread into spaces that seemed unlivable. The rebound after the rain was explosive, with diversity blooming in ways that shaped the next age of life. Yet there is also caution, because this resilience came at a steep cost. Entire lineages of plants and animals vanished, forests collapsed, and ecosystems took millions of years to find balance again. What survived was transformed forever. This dual lesson matters deeply today. On one hand, it tells us that life is inventive, able to bend under pressure without always breaking. On the other, it reminds us that recovery after collapse is never quick. The forests and reefs that return are not the same as those that disappeared. Extinction is permanent, and while ecosystems eventually rebound, they may look nothing like what came before. In modern times, researchers studying extreme rainfall see patterns that echo the past. Heavy storms are linked to shifting greenhouse gases, much as they were during the Triassic. Regions that once knew steady seasons now endure unpredictable bursts of rain. Floodplains widen, wetlands expand, and species must either adapt, move, or perish. The rains of the past whisper a warning. Water can be both a giver of life and a force that overwhelms it. From this deep history, scientists draw insights into resilience. They see that species with flexibility in their diets, their habitats, or their reproductive strategies are often the ones that survive. They note that partnerships between organisms, such as fungi with plants or microbes with animals, helped keep ecosystems alive. They recognize that survival often depended on small beginnings, like spores waiting in the mud or seeds drifting to new lands. These are not only scientific observations, but quiet truths about how life holds on in the face of extremes. The ancient rain cycles also show us that extremes do not happen in isolation. They ripple outward, connecting land, sea, and sky. When rainfall surged millions of years ago, it did not simply flood valleys. It changed the chemistry of oceans, the fertility of soils, and the very balance of oxygen in the air. In the present, when heavy rains fall on deforested hillsides, or when rivers swollen by storms deliver vast loads of sediment into the sea, we are seeing similar interconnected threads. Each system is tied to the next, and stress in one place resonates across the whole. Perhaps the greatest lesson is humility. The rains of the Triassic lasted for millions of years. In comparison, our species has existed for only a small fraction of that time. The storms remind us how powerful Earth's climate can be, and how vulnerable even the most dominant creatures are when nature shifts. The warning they offer is not of hopelessness, but of perspective. Life endured, but at great cost. If we listen carefully, we can recognize the signals in our own age and act before the water reshapes our world beyond recognition. The rains of the Triassic are long gone, sealed away in stone and mud, yet their echoes remain alive all around us. To see them, one only needs to step into the swamps, wetlands, and rainforests of today. These places are not just lush and vibrant. They are windows into how life learned to endure when water threatened to overwhelm the earth. They are living analogs, carrying forward strategies that first took shape during that drowned age. Modern swamps, with their dark waters and tangled roots, tell this story clearly. Here, trees grow not on dry soil, but in waterlogged ground that would suffocate most plants. Cypress knees, mangrove roots, and floating mats of vegetation show the same kind of ingenuity that ancient plants developed when endless rain turned forests into swamps. These adaptations are not chance curiosities. They are echoes of survival strategies tested long ago when life had no choice but to evolve ways of breathing, growing, and feeding in water-heavy worlds. Rainforests, too, carry this memory. They thrive in regions where heavy rain never seems far away, where dampness rules the air and the ground is never fully dry. Layers of green crowd into every available space, with plants competing for light in much the same way their Triassic ancestors once struggled beneath storm-darkened skies. The richness of a rainforest, filled with thousands of species packed tightly together, mirrors the kind of ecological density that may have emerged after the long storms ended and new opportunities arose. These forests are not just beautiful, they are archives of resilience. Wetlands, whether vast floodplains or small marshes, may hold the closest resemblance to the drowned landscapes of the past. Their soils are often anoxic, starved of oxygen, yet life thrives there in abundance. Fish spawn in their shallow waters, insects teem along their edges, and birds nest in their reeds. Beneath the surface, microbes work tirelessly, recycling nutrients in ways that sustain the entire ecosystem. This hidden labor is precisely what allowed ancient ecosystems to persist during the Great Rains. When larger plants struggled and animals faced collapse, microbes and fungi kept the cycles of decay and renewal turning. The microbial strategies of those ancient days remain unchanged. In a modern swamp, mats of cyanobacteria or colonies of sulfate-reducing microbes play roles nearly identical to their ancestors millions of years ago. They thrive in low light, low oxygen, and high moisture, conditions that recall the Triassic floods. Their persistence is a reminder that the smallest forms of life are often the most enduring. Where forests fall and seas rise, microbes adapt without pause, carrying forward an unbroken line of survival that began before the rains and continues into our own time. Some of the creatures we know today are direct descendants of those who endured the stormy past. Amphibians, with their need for water to breed and their skin that breathes as much as it protects, remain tied to wet environments. They survived the endless rain, and their modern cousins continue to embody that legacy. Certain plant lineages, too, still bear the marks of that watery era. Ferns, for instance, spread through spores that can ride wind or water, a survival trait that once gave them resilience when seeds would rot in saturated soils. Even conifers, though more at home in drier conditions today, carry genetic memories of ancestors that endured through the instability of the Carnian. When scientists study today's wetlands and rainforests, they are not only cataloging species, they are listening for echoes of deep time. Every microbial mat, every swamp-rooted tree, and every amphibian chorus at dusk is part of a survival story that began under storm-dark skies millions of years ago. The continuity is striking. The strategies that allowed life to endure, then resilience through flexibility, partnerships between species, and reliance on the smallest forms of life still shape the ecosystems we see today. It is in these living systems that we can most clearly see how the past never truly vanishes. The rain ended, but the lessons of survival remained encoded in the fabric of life. When we walk through a rainforest dripping with mist or paddle through a marsh thick with reeds, we are moving through echoes of that drowned age. The same solutions that preserved life during 2 million years of storms continue to hum quietly in the present, binding past and present in a seamless thread of survival. Imagine again that ancient world where the sky never cleared. Day after day, gray clouds gathered in endless procession, their weight pressing down upon the earth. Rain fell in sheets, in torrents, in unbroken rhythm that lasted not for years or centuries, but for millions of years. Forests drowned, rivers overflowed their banks until they became seas, and the sun's warmth rarely pierced the curtain of storms. By every measure, it should have been too much. Life should have vanished under the relentless downpour, yet it did not. What survived was not the strongest, nor the largest, but the most adaptable. Microbes that clung to wet soils, fungi that recycled rot into nourishment, plants that sheltered their offspring in hardy spores, and animals small enough to hide in shallow waters or climb to higher ground. From this fragile persistence came a future where the world recovered, where ecosystems rebuilt themselves into vibrant new forms. The rain tested life to its limit, but in doing so, it also sparked resilience that carried forward through deep time. The rocks of the Triassic still whisper of this trial, in layers of silt hardened into stone, in fossilized spores scattered across ancient mud, and in coral skeletons recording pulses of stress and renewal. We find proof of a planet that should not have lived and yet did. The evidence is quiet but undeniable. It tells us that survival is often less about conquest and more about endurance, less about dominance and more about patience. It is almost miraculous to consider that every creature alive today carries within it the legacy of ancestors who endured that drowned age. The birds outside a window, the trees bending beneath modern rains, the fungi hidden in forest soil, all are connected to survivors who weathered a storm that seemed endless. Their persistence means that when we look at life around us, we are looking at triumph over the impossible. And it leads to a haunting question. If life could withstand 2 million years of unbroken storms, what else might it endure? What other challenges might Earth throw against it, only for life to bend, adapt, and emerge once more? The thought is both humbling and awe-inspiring. It reminds us that the history of life is not just one of flourishing, but of surviving trials that seemed beyond all hope. As we drift to the end of this story, I would like to thank you for spending this quiet time exploring with me. These journeys are as much about wonder as they are about science, and sharing them with you is what keeps this little corner of curiosity alive. If you have found peace or fascination here tonight, a gentle like or a tap of the subscribe button helps this channel grow and reach others who might be searching for the same calm. Perhaps you might even share this with a friend who enjoys drifting into sleep with a story of deep time. And if you feel like leaving a comment, I would love to know where you are listening from and what time it is there as you hear this. It is always beautiful to see how far across the world these quiet explorations travel. For now, let the sound of that eternal rain fade softly in your mind. Let the image of a world remade by storms settle into stillness. Life endured what should have ended it, and in that endurance lies the quiet miracle of survival.